Hey guys, I wanted to make a video talking about the narrator that we finally met in the last video. There he sits on his rocking chair in what's called the Lord's Room, and that's actually a room hidden somewhere in Castle Aventheim. Now, I wanted to make a distinction between this guy and the narrator that talks to us before we get the title of every scene. I don't consider these two the same narrator, although I could be wrong. The main reason being that for the narration that happens before the title of a scene, first of all, there's no creaking noise that's kind of distinct. And secondly, sometimes this narrator talks about things that I don't expect the creaking narrator to know about. So I consider this narrator to be something more of an outside the game sort of narrator. Anyway, back to the creaking narrator. He mentioned that he created this castle during the times of great chaos amongst the worlds. Now what he means by that is he oversaw the creation of the castle. But the castle itself was built by Tiamats. Eventually the Tiamats began to decline, and when the time was right, the Night Kingdom, or the Glevnir Kingdom, forced them out. That was several generations ago. However, this guy stayed behind. Because he oversaw the creation of the castle, he's known as the Lord of Aventheim Castle, and that's how I'll refer to him from now on. Anyway, he goes on to say that he's been observing for generations, and what he wants to know is what makes humans tick. He wants to understand humans, and as such he's been a silent observer for hundreds if not thousands of years. That in and of itself is pretty cool to me. However, he does serve a different purpose too, a narrative purpose. Especially if you consider the limitations that the Wisp has of discussing the plot. Here we see the Wisp, of course, just a ball of light. He has no mouth, he can't talk, and that's certainly by design by the developers. They did that on purpose. As a result, he really can't express himself very well. He's interesting to contrast to, say, Navi of The Legend of Zelda. She's more or less a ball of light. I think it's understood that she's actually a fairy with, a fairy body or whatever, but she's expressed as a ball of light. Now, of course, she can speak, but if we ignore that and take it away from her, she can still emote. If you've played the game, then you've seen when she's pissed off or agitated in some way, she'll zoom around really quickly. In other cases, when she's surprised, she'll kind of do a jolt in place. So even though she's just a ball of light, she has a fair bit of body language. However, when we look at the Wisp, he really doesn't do that type of thing, does he? In fact, one of the few times he does a direct communication is with Maria on Dussel Bridge when she finally meets up with us. During the conversation, Maria says, "Hey, you and me are on the same team. Let's team up, what do you say?" And the Wisp's response is to slowly go up to her, and then he went as far as to not kill her. So that was an affirmative. And Maria acknowledges this with a short bow. The only other thing he really does is sometimes when he appears on screen, he makes sort of a motor revving noise. He did it when we finally met Aquina face to face. Let's check it out. So the issue that the developers have created is that they have a protagonist who can't very well express himself. Now, Maria is with us during portions of the game, and she can help explain what's happening with the plot. But there's a significant amount of the game where she's not around, and so we have no one to really lean on. All we have is the plot itself to try and draw conclusions with. And that's where the Lord of Aventheim comes in. He's there to offer some kind of a commentary on what's happening. So for example, early in the game, while we're floating around as the Wisp, the player doesn't really know what's going on. However, the Lord of Aventheim pipes up and says, "You're pursuing that maiden." So he helps explain the plot in that manner. He also has the opportunity to offer some insight on what's going on with the king. Here he's saying, "Can you bear it? The thoughts of the people, dying regrets of those who lost their lives in this very spot." Something that doesn't really get addressed in the game itself, and that's what this guy's job is. To bring it up and make sure it's something that the player is thinking of. Of course, since the Lord of Aventheim is observing because he's trying to learn, he's asking questions himself, such as in this screenshot where he asks, "Is it anger over having your life stolen, or sadness over having your kingdom stolen, or is it both?" So he's trying to learn along with us, the player, and trying to establish the motive of the Wisp. Here's another example when we finally found the royal sarcophagus. We were quickly jumped by monsters, but when the Wisp approached it, he just kind of sat there. And of course, he can't talk, so there's nothing really to do. There's no inner monologue with the Wisp. There's no way to know what he's thinking. So unfortunately, he can't address what's going on. Fortunately, the Lord of Aventheim will start to narrate and say, "Your body is gone and lost, yet you are fixated only on your own cooled flesh." Okay, so in other words, hey player, yeah, guess what? The body is gone. Shortly after, the Lord of Aventheim says, "Many people seek the body of the arbitrator. Will you be able to reclaim it first?" And this is a reference to Yelma trying to get to the corpse as well as Algerie herself. So it helps to keep the player informed on what the hell's going on. He also says some things that he knows about only because he's the silent observer who sees everything. So he mentions while we travel in Fort Gerhard, a champion of fear has claimed this fortress. You cannot proceed until it has been defeated. So he's sort of musing to himself and wondering what's going to happen to the Wisp, but at the same time he's delivering some exposition to the player. So now as the player we understand, oh, there's a boss here. Furthermore, he serves a purpose as the flashback narrator. Of course, his creaking is present there too, so we know it's him. And he mentions things that the Wisp couldn't know, Maria couldn't know, things that only a silent observer could know. For example, here he's talking about the downfall of Sir Gunther, who was actually the boss of Fort Gerhard. Another example is this flashback when we saw Firenze and Andreas killed by the werewolf. There were no survivors, no one lived except of course the werewolf, and it's not like he's going to tell anybody. So the only way we know this is through the observation of the Lord of Aventheim. Now another thing that's cool about this guy is that he's not an impartial observer. He forms his own opinions, and in fact he starts to come down on the Wisp a couple times. Of course, who could forget when we face off against Vienna, the little Westcan girl? It wasn't easy to do that as the player, and the Lord of Aventheim wasn't too pleased with it either. Do you still wish to return, even if you are hated by everyone, King Wilmgard? In other words, what a fucking asshole. After we kill Vienna, he mentions, "So you're going to do whatever it takes to get what you want, huh? Interesting." I love that angle where he's still learning, and he's observing and trying to figure out what makes the king do what he does. So we can see that the Lord of Aventheim's a pretty interesting character. He not only provides exposition, but he also promotes discussion on the motives of the Wisp and what's happening in the game. The creators have made a point not to be too specific with him, so there's a lot unknown. For example, this black cat that sits with him, is that a real cat or is it a familiar? I should point out that cat-like familiars are established in the Department Heaven games, but we don't know. And so it ends with him returning to his observation. And I guess we're doing the same thing too, aren't we? We're going to see how this plays out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.